Thomas Miller wiped the sweat from his brow as the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across his 5-acre property. The small farm, nestled in the rolling hills just outside the rapidly expanding suburb of Oak Ridge Heights, had been in his family for 3 generations. As he walked the perimeter of his vegetable gardens, the familiar scent of fertile soil and ripening tomatoes filled his nostrils, a smell no fancy cologne could ever replicate. His weathered hands brushed against the leaves of heirloom vegetables, varieties his grandfather had brought from the old country and that supermarkets had long forgotten existed. The vibrant purple-striped eggplants and rainbow chard stood in stark contrast to the cookie-cutter precision of the new development visible just beyond his northern property line. The distant sound of construction had become the soundtrack of Thomas's days over the past few years. Where once there had been fields and woodland, now stood Emerald Estates, a luxury housing development with identical Spanish-style homes, each with the same terracotta roof and desert-inspired landscaping, despite being in a region where seasonal rain was plentiful. As Thomas made his way toward the chicken coop to collect eggs for dinner, he could hear the clucking of his Rhode Island Reds and Buff Orpingtons, hens that produced eggs with yolks so orange they looked artificial compared to store-bought. The small flock scattered about as he approached, pecking at insects and seeds in their spacious, straw-lined enclosure. "Evening, ladies," Thomas murmured, a daily greeting that had become ritual. Beyond the coop stood his pride and joy, 25 beehives painted in gentle blues and whites, strategically placed near his wildflower meadow. The honey these bees produced had won regional awards 3 years running, with local chefs paying premium prices for its distinctive floral notes. As dusk settled over the landscape, Thomas returned to his modest farmhouse, a 2-story structure with a wraparound porch where his grandmother had once shelled peas and told stories. The paint may have been fading in places, and the roof might need attention soon, but the century-old oak floors inside creaked with character, telling stories no new construction could ever possess. From his porch, Thomas could see the lights coming on in Emerald Estates, illuminating identical patios and swimming pools. He sipped his evening tea, savoring the tranquility of his holdout property, a living museum of agricultural tradition surrounded by the relentless march of suburban expansion. The glossy brochure landed in Thomas's mailbox for the 3rd time that month. Join the prestigious Emerald Estates community. It proclaimed in embossed gold lettering above a photo of smiling, impossibly perfect families enjoying a community pool. Thomas tossed it into his recycling bin alongside the previous copies, noting that they'd at least used his correct name this time. 3 years ago, when the first bulldozers had arrived to clear the adjacent Johnson property, Thomas had watched with a sinking feeling. The developer, Pinnacle Homes, had sent a representative, a slick-haired man named James Harrington, to his door no fewer than 7 times with increasingly generous offers. "Mr. Miller," Harrington had said during their last meeting, leaning against his luxury SUV, "I'm authorized to go to $1.2 million. That's nearly triple your property's assessed value." Thomas had declined with the same answer he'd given each time. "This land isn't just property to me, Mr. Harrington. It's my heritage and my future." Now, as Thomas drove his weathered pickup truck past the imposing stone entrance of Emerald Estates on his way to deliver honey to the farmer's market, he could see the community had taken shape with frightening efficiency. The homes, starting at $850,000 according to the billboard, were arranged in perfect rows, each lawn precisely the same shade of green despite the natural drought conditions that had Thomas conserving water from his rain barrels. At the community center, visible from the main road, a group of well-dressed residents were gathered for what appeared to be a homeowners' meeting. Thomas recognized a few faces, former customers who had stopped visiting his farm stand after moving into Emerald Estates, as though his organic vegetables might somehow contaminate their new lifestyle. Later that week, Thomas noticed surveyors at the edge of his property line. When questioned, they claimed to be just updating county records, but Thomas spotted the Pinnacle Homes logo on their equipment. That evening, he pulled out his property deed and land survey from the fireproof safe hidden beneath a floorboard in his pantry, documents his father had impressed upon him to protect at all costs. The following day, a certified letter arrived. It contained promotional materials for the Emerald Estates Homeowners Association, including a schedule of dues and a comprehensive list of community bylaws. Attached was a note that read, "As a property owner in the newly rezoned Oak Ridge Heights Eastern District, your participation in community standards maintenance is appreciated." Thomas frowned, reading the line twice. His property hadn't been rezoned to his knowledge. The bylaws prohibited everything from clotheslines to vegetable gardens visible from the street, and specifically banned livestock of any kind, including, but not limited to chickens, rabbits, and bees. "Well, that's ridiculous," Thomas muttered to himself, setting the papers aside. His property had been zoned for agricultural use since before Oak Ridge Heights was even incorporated as a town. Still, a seed of unease had been planted, one that would grow more rapidly than he could have imagined. The buzzing of bees provided a soothing backdrop as Thomas carefully extracted honey-laden frames from one of his hives. His protective suit, worn and patched in places, was a second skin after decades of beekeeping. So absorbed was he in this delicate process that he didn't notice the black Mercedes SUV pulling up to his property until the slam of its door broke his concentration. A woman in her early 50s, dressed in a cream-colored pantsuit that seemed impractical for the dusty surroundings, approached the fence line. Her salon-perfect blonde hair didn't move in the gentle breeze, and diamond studs caught the morning light as she raised a manicured hand in a stiff wave. Thomas closed the hive and removed his protective hood, making his way across the field. "Mr. Miller," the woman's voice carried the practiced warmth of someone who had led many corporate meetings. "I'm Diane Westfield, president of the Emerald Estates Homeowners Association." Thomas nodded without extending his hand, aware he was covered in bits of honeycomb and propolis. "What can I do for you, Ms. Westfield?" Her practiced smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "I wanted to personally deliver this notice." She reached into an expensive-looking leather portfolio and withdrew an official-looking document. "We've received numerous complaints about your activities." Thomas took the paper, scanning its contents with increasing disbelief. It claimed his property was in violation of at least 12 HOA bylaws, including unauthorized agricultural activities, improper waste management, referring to his compost heap, unapproved animal husbandry, and aesthetic inconsistency with community standards. "Ma'am," Thomas said carefully, "I think there's been a misunderstanding. My property isn't part of Emerald Estates." Diane's smile didn't reach her eyes. "Perhaps you're not aware of the recent rezoning. The entire Eastern District has been incorporated into our master-planned community governance." Thomas folded the paper deliberately. "I've never signed anything agreeing to join your HOA. My property has been zoned agricultural for over 70 years. The county commissioners approved the rezoning package last month," she said, her voice taking on a rehearsed quality. "All properties in this sector now fall under our covenant. You've been allocated 30 days to bring your property into compliance, though given the extensive nature of your violations, we're willing to discuss a reasonable timeline." Thomas felt heat rising in his face. "I'm afraid you're mistaken. I would have received notification of any rezoning affecting my property." Diane's expression hardened. "The notices were published in the county register as required by law. Your failure to object during the comment period constitutes tacit acceptance." She gestured toward his beehives. "Those will need to be removed immediately. They pose a health hazard to our residents, several of whom have allergies." "My bees stay," Thomas said firmly. "They're registered with the state agricultural department and are essential pollinators for farms within a 3-mile radius." "Mr. Miller," Diane said, her tone shifting to one of condescension, "I understand change can be difficult, but Emerald Estates represents progress and increased property values for everyone in the area. Your farm is becoming an eyesore as the community develops around it. We've had complaints about odors, unsightly equipment, and potential vermin." Thomas felt his jaw tighten. His farm was immaculate. He prided himself on its cleanliness and sustainability. "I believe this conversation is over, Ms. Westfield. I'll have my attorney review your claims about rezoning, but until then, I suggest you stay on your side of the property line." Diane's smile returned, brittle and cold. "We were hoping for cooperation, Mr. Miller. The HOA board is prepared to be reasonable, but we're also committed to maintaining community standards. Our next step would involve formal enforcement actions." As she turned to leave, she added over her shoulder, "By the way, we have it on good authority that the county health department might be interested in your unpermitted food production operations. It would be unfortunate if an anonymous complaint were filed." Thomas watched her return to her vehicle, his hands shaking slightly, not from fear, but from a slow-burning anger. In the distance, he could see several residents of Emerald Estates watching from their perfectly landscaped yards, some with phones raised, apparently documenting his violations. That evening, Thomas pulled out a dusty box of his father's papers and began searching for anything related to property easements, zoning restrictions, or land use agreements. Something wasn't right, and the veiled threat in Diane's parting words suggested this was just the beginning. The envelope bore the embossed letterhead of Finch, Harrington, and Westfield, attorneys at law. Thomas noted the familiar surname with grim understanding as he sliced it open at his kitchen table. Inside was a 4-page letter filled with legal terminology and veiled threats, essentially reiterating Diane's claims, but with the added weight of apparent legal authority. This was the third such letter in 2 weeks. Each had grown progressively more threatening, with this one including the phrase "failure to comply will result in injunctive relief" being sought without further notice. Thomas had already visited the county clerk's office the day after Diane's visit, where a sympathetic clerk named Eleanor had helped him search through recent zoning records. They had found nothing indicating his property had been rezoned or incorporated into any master planned community. "This is your deed right here," Eleanor had said, pointing to the digitized record on her computer screen. "And here's your zoning classification, still A1 agricultural. Hasn't changed since 1978. She had leaned closer, lowering her voice. "Between you and me, something fishy is going on with some of these developers. Had 3 other folks in here this month with similar concerns." Thomas had her print certified copies of all relevant documents, which now sat in a growing file labeled HOA Harassment. The following morning, as Thomas was setting up his stand at the farmer's market, he noticed an immediate change in the atmosphere. Regular customers who lived in Emerald Estates visibly avoided his booth, some even making deliberate detours. Midway through the market, Thomas spotted Diane and 2 other well-dressed women moving from vendor to vendor, engaged in hushed conversations. After each interaction, the vendors would glance uncomfortably in Thomas's direction. By noon, the market manager, a usually friendly woman named Paula, approached his stand. "Thomas," she began nervously, "I've received some concerns about your products." "What concerns?" Thomas asked, genuinely confused. His produce and honey were the market's top sellers, and he'd passed every health inspection with flying colors. Paula shifted uncomfortably. "Some customers have questioned whether your farm meets current health regulations. They've mentioned seeing conditions that might not be up to standard." Thomas felt his face flush. "Paula, you've been to my farm. You know that's nonsense." "I know," she said quietly, "but they're threatening to file formal complaints against the market if we don't address it. They've already convinced the bread guy and the flour lady to sign some petition." She glanced over her shoulder. "I hate this, Thomas, but could you maybe take a week off until I sort this out? I can't risk losing our market permit." The ride home was a blur of anger and disbelief. As Thomas turned onto his road, he noticed an unfamiliar black SUV driving slowly past his property. The driver, a man in sunglasses, was holding up a phone, apparently taking photos or video. When he spotted Thomas, he accelerated quickly away. That evening, Thomas called the one lawyer he knew, his second cousin Mark, who practiced corporate law in the city. After explaining the situation, there was a long pause on the line. "Thomas," Mark said finally, "this sounds like a deliberate harassment campaign. The fact that one of the HOA board members shares a name with the law firm is particularly concerning, could indicate a conflict of interest. And the sudden social isolation, the market situation, these are pressure tactics." "But why?" Thomas asked. "I've declined their offers to buy my land. but I'm not hurting anyone by staying. Development is big money, Mark replied. Your 5 acres might be the missing piece in some larger plan. Listen, I don't practice this kind of law, but I know someone who does. Her name is Sarah Chen, specializes in property rights, and has gone up against developers before. I'll call her first thing tomorrow. Thomas thanked him and hung up, then walked out to his porch. The night was clear, stars visible above his property in a way they weren't above the light-polluted Emerald Estates. In the distance, he could make out the silhouettes of several people standing at the edge of the development, looking in his direction. He would later wish he had taken photos of them, documented everything from the beginning, because by morning, things would escalate beyond anything he had imagined possible. The farmers' market ran until 2 p.m. on Saturdays, and Thomas had decided to attend despite Paula's request. His livelihood depended on these sales. The market had been tense, with only his most loyal customers braving the disapproving glares of Emerald Estates residents to purchase his honey and vegetables. Still, he'd managed to sell most of his inventory, including a large honey order to Oak Ridge Heights' most popular farm-to-table restaurant. It was approaching 4 p.m. when Thomas turned his truck onto the gravel road leading to his farm. The first sign that something was wrong was the line of vehicles parked along the usually empty road. 3 white vans with Valley Demolition Services printed on their sides, 2 security SUVs, and a black Mercedes he recognized as Diane's. Thomas accelerated, dust billowing behind his truck, his heart pounding. As his property came into view, he slammed on the brakes, momentarily unable to process what he was seeing. A crew of workers in hard hats was dismantling his chicken coop. The chickens themselves were nowhere to be seen. Another team was loading his beehives, his livelihood, onto a flabbed truck. A third group operated a small bulldozer that was currently plowing through his meticulously maintained vegetable garden, destroying months of work in seconds. Thomas leaped from his truck, running toward the nearest worker. "Stop! What are you doing? This is private property." 2 men in security uniforms intercepted him before he could reach the demolition crew. Both wore expressions of practiced indifference. "Sir, we need you to stay back," the taller one said, placing a firm hand on Thomas's chest. "This is my property. You have no right to be here." Thomas tried to push past them, but they held firm. "We're executing a court order, sir," the security guard replied, nodding to his partner, who produced a document from his jacket pocket. Thomas snatched the paper, scanning it with increasing horror. It was indeed a court order, authorizing the removal of non-compliant structures from the property. The order cited repeated and willful violations of community covenants and health hazards endangering adjacent properties. "This is forgery," Thomas said, his voice shaking. "I was never served with any court documents. I never had a hearing." "Service was confirmed by affidavit," the guard replied mechanically. "We're just doing our job, sir." Over the guard's shoulder, Thomas spotted Diane Westfield standing near his barn, which now had large orange X's spray-painted on its weathered wood siding. She was speaking to a man in a suit who was gesturing at the structure. "Where are my animals?" Thomas demanded, panic rising in his voice. "Animal control took the chickens," the second guard answered. "The beehives are being relocated to an appropriate facility." Thomas fumbled for his phone, his hands shaking so badly he could barely dial. The first call was to 911. "I need police at 1478 Old Mill Road immediately," he told the dispatcher. "There are people illegally demolishing my property." His second call was to Mark, who answered on the first ring. "They're destroying everything," Thomas said, his voice breaking. "They claim to have a court order. They've taken my chickens. They're loading up my beehives. They've bulldozed my garden." "I'm calling Sarah right now," Mark interrupted. "Don't engage with them. Document everything. Take photos, video, get names if you can. I'll be there in 40 minutes. Thomas ended the call and began recording video with his phone, capturing the destruction of his farm from every angle. When he attempted to approach his barn, where workers were now unloading crowbars and sledgehammers, the security guards physically blocked his path. "That structure is scheduled for immediate demolition due to safety concerns," one stated flatly. That barn has stood for 90 years. Thomas shouted, his composure finally breaking. It's structurally certified. I had it inspected last year. A police cruiser pulled up 20 minutes later, an eternity during which Thomas had watched helplessly as workers began removing the wooden siding from his barn, exposing the historic post and beam framework within. The officer who approached seemed young and uncomfortable with the situation. Thomas rushed to explain, showing him the property deed and agricultural zoning documents he'd retrieved from his truck's glove compartment. The officer reviewed both the court order and Thomas's documentation with a furrowed brow. "This is complicated," he finally said. "They do have a court order, which I'm not authorized to override, but your documentation does raise questions about jurisdiction." "They're destroying my livelihood," Thomas pleaded. "Can't you at least stop them until we sort this out?" The officer approached the security team and the apparent foreman of the demolition crew, engaging in a heated discussion Thomas couldn't quite hear. After several minutes, the officer returned. "I'm sorry, sir. The order appears valid on its face, which means I can't intervene. This is a civil matter that needs to be addressed through the courts. I've asked them to preserve any structures not specifically mentioned in the order, but that's all I can do." Thomas felt a wave of despair wash over him. "Officer, please, at least let me recover my personal property from the barn before they tear it down." After another discussion with the security team, the officer escorted Thomas to the barn, where he was allowed to retrieve a few precious items: an antique wooden chest containing family photographs, his grandfather's handmade tools, and a quilt his mother had made from fabric remnants of 3 generations of family clothing. As Thomas carried these treasures back to his truck, he spotted Diane watching him, her expression impossible to read from a distance. When she saw him looking, she turned away to speak into her phone. By the time Mark arrived with Sarah Chin, a petite woman whose determined expression belied her small stature, the demolition crews were packing up for the day. The damage, however, was done. The chicken coop was a pile of splintered wood. The garden was an unrecognizable stretch of churned earth. The beehives were gone, and the barn, while still standing, had been partially dismantled, with gaping holes in its sides exposing the interior to the elements. Sarah surveyed the scene with the calculating eye of someone cataloging evidence rather than destruction. "This," she said quietly to Thomas, "is one of the most egregious abuses of HOA power I've ever seen, and I specialize in fighting these cases." She turned to face him fully. "Mr. Miller, if you'll have me as your attorney, I promise you this: we will not only stop them from taking another inch of your property, we will make them pay for every splinter of damage they've caused today." As dusk settled over the ravaged farm, Thomas sat on his porch steps, surrounded by the few rescued artifacts of his family's agricultural legacy, and nodded his acceptance of Sarah's offer. The lights of Emerald Estates glowed in the distance, their perfect symmetry now seeming less like order and more like a prison. Sarah Chen's law office occupied the 3rd floor of a modest building in downtown Oak Ridge Heights. Unlike the imposing glass tower housing Finch, Harrington, and Westfield across the street, Chen Property Rights Law was a 3-person operation: Sarah, her paralegal Miguel, and her assistant Jasmine. Thomas sat across from Sarah, watching as she meticulously arranged documents across her desk. 3 weeks had passed since the demolition, and each day had brought new discoveries about the web of deception surrounding his property. "Let me make sure I understand the timeline," Sarah said, tapping a yellow legal pad with her pen. "You received no formal notice of any court hearing. You were never properly served with any legal documents prior to the demolition crew arriving. And you had already verified with the county that your property remained zoned agricultural, not residential." Thomas nodded, fatigue evident in the dark circles beneath his eyes. He'd been sleeping in his truck most nights, afraid to leave his property unattended after dark. "That alone constitutes multiple violations of due process," Sarah continued. "But what we've uncovered goes far beyond procedural errors." She slid a document across the desk. "This is the supposed easement agreement they presented to the court, allegedly signed by you 3 months ago, granting Emerald Estates access rights across your property for infrastructure development." Thomas examined the document, his expression darkening. This signature isn't even close to mine. Anyone who's seen my actual signature would know that." "Exactly," Sarah agreed. "And the notary who supposedly witnessed this signature doesn't exist. We checked the state database of licensed notaries. Completely fabricated." Miguel entered with a stack of files. "I got the records from the Planning Commission," he said, setting them down. "You were right. The official zoning maps and the ones presented at the hearing don't match." Sarah nodded grimly. "They literally created a false map to present to the judge, showing your property as part of the Emerald Estates planned community." She turned to Thomas. "This goes beyond HOA overreach. This is fraud, forgery, and potentially criminal conspiracy." Thomas rubbed his temples. "But why?" "I understand they want my land, but this level of deception seems extreme, even for developers." Sarah exchanged glances with Miguel. "Show him," she said quietly. Miguel opened his laptop and turned it toward Thomas. On the screen was a rendering of a shopping complex labeled Emerald Marketplace, with high-end stores, restaurants, and a central plaza. The complex was situated on land that included Thomas's property and extended into what was currently Emerald Estates. "This was filed with the State Economic Development Office 6 months ago," Miguel explained. "It's a $40 million commercial project. According to the application, it's being developed by Pinnacle Commercial Partners." "I've never heard of them," Thomas said, studying the image. "That's because they were incorporated just last year," Sarah replied. "We did some digging into their corporate structure." She slid another document across the desk. "Pinnacle Commercial Partners has 3 primary shareholders: James Harrington, the developer who tried to buy your land; Richard Finch, the senior partner at the law firm representing the HOA; and Diane Westfield." Thomas finished, the pieces falling into place. "The HOA president herself," Sarah confirmed. "They've been planning this from the beginning. The residential development was Phase 1. The commercial complex is Phase 2, and your property sits right in the middle of where they want to build their crown jewel, a luxury boutique hotel." Thomas stepped back, stunned by the scale of the deception. "So all this, the harassment, the false legal documents, the demolition, it was never about HOA rules or community standards. It was about forcing me out so they could complete their commercial project." "Exactly," Sarah said. "And they've been systematically working to isolate you, pressure you, and ultimately remove your ability to sustain yourself on that land." She leaned forward. "The good news is they've made critical mistakes. The forged documents, the falsified maps, the undisclosed conflicts of interest. These are all actionable offenses, and the court doesn't look kindly on being deliberately missiled." Thomas stared out the window at the Finch, Harrington, and Westfield building across the street. "What's our next step?" Sarah's expression hardened with determination. "We file for an emergency injunction to prevent any further action against your property. We initiate a civil suit for damages, fraud, and harassment." And she added, her voice taking on a steely quality, "We contact the district attorney about potential criminal charges for document forgery and perjury." As Thomas left the office, Sarah's words gave him the first sense of hope he felt in weeks. In his truck, he found a business card tucked under his windshield wiper. It bore the logo of the Oak Ridge Heights Gazette and a handwritten note. "Interested in hearing your side of the story? Call me, Rebecca Jong, investigative reporter." Thomas pocketed the card, a plan beginning to form in his mind. If the developers had used their influence to manipulate the system against him, perhaps it was time to leverage the power of public opinion in his defense. The Oak Ridge County Courthouse stood as a dignified contrast to the sleek modernity of downtown, a stone building with columns and wooden benches worn smooth by decades of anxious litigants. Today, Courtroom 3 was filled beyond capacity, with local residents, reporters, and curious onlookers crowding the available seating. Rebecca Jong's series of investigative articles in the Gazette had transformed Thomas's private legal struggle into a cause caliber. Her meticulous reporting had exposed not only the tactics used against Thomas, but also unveiled a pattern of similar behavior by the developers in neighboring counties. The final piece in her series, Demolishing the American Dream, How Developers Use HOAs as Weapons had gone viral nationally, bringing attention from larger media outlets and advocacy groups. Thomas sat beside Sarah Chen at the plaintiff's table, dressed in the one suit he owned, purchased for his father's funeral years earlier. Across the aisle, the defense table was crowded with lawyers from Finch, Harrington, and Westfield, though conspicuously missing the named partners themselves. Diane Westfield sat rigidly among them, her expression carefully neutral. Judge Marian Alvarez, a veteran jurist known for her no-nonsense approach, entered the courtroom. After the formalities, she fixed her gaze on the assembled attorneys. "I've reviewed the filings in this matter extensively," she began, "and I must say in 30 years on the bench, I've rarely seen allegations this troubling. We'll proceed with arguments on the plaintiff's motion for preliminary injunction and the defense's motion to dismiss." Sarah Chen rose, her petite stature belying the commanding presence she established as she approached the podium. "Your Honor, this case represents one of the most egregious abuses of power I've encountered in my practice. The defendants, operating through the Emerald Estates Homeowners Association, systematically targeted my client's property through harassment, fraudulent legal actions, and ultimately, physical destruction, all based on the false premise that his property was subject to their authority." She methodically laid out the evidence: the falsified easement document, complete with a forensic handwriting analysis confirming the forgery, the doctored zoning maps presented to the court to obtain the demolition order, sworn affidavits from county employees stating that Thomas's property remained zoned agricultural, and photographs documenting the destruction of his farm. "Most disturbing, Your Honor," Sarah continued, "is the clear conflict of interest at the heart of these actions." She presented corporate filings showing the relationship between the HOA leadership and Pinnacle Commercial Partners. The individuals orchestrating this campaign against Mr. Miller stood to gain millions from the commercial development planned for his property. They used the HOA as a weapon to attempt to force him from land that has been in his family for generations. The lead attorney for the defense, a young man whose confident demeanor seemed to waver under the judge's scrutiny, argued that Thomas had been properly served with all relevant notices, that the HOA had acted in good faith based on their understanding of the property boundaries, and that any discrepancies in documentation were merely administrative errors rather than deliberate deception. "Your Honor," he concluded, "this is fundamentally a dispute about community standards and property maintenance. Mr. Miller's activities were creating health and safety hazards for Emerald Estates residents, and the HOA acted within its authority to address those concerns." Judge Alvarez's expression grew increasingly skeptical throughout the defense's presentation. When the attorney attempted to introduce a newly discovered membership agreement allegedly signed by Thomas, the judge's patience visibly evaporated. "Counsel," she interrupted, "am I to understand you're presenting a document that wasn't included in your initial filings, that purportedly establishes the plaintiff's consent to HOA governance, and that conveniently appears after allegations of document forgery have been raised?" The attorney faltered. "We recently located this in our records, Your Honor." "Approach the bench, both of you," Judge Alvarez ordered. After a heated sidebar discussion, the judge addressed the courtroom. "I've seen enough. The defense's motion to dismiss is denied. The plaintiff's motion for a preliminary injunction is granted. No further action may be taken against Mr. Miller's property by the defendants or any agents acting on their behalf." She fixed the defense table with a stern gaze. "Furthermore, I'm referring this matter to the district attorney's office for review of potential criminal charges related to fraud upon the court, forgery of legal documents, and perjury." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. In the gallery, Rebecca Jung was already typing furiously on her laptop. "Additionally," Judge Alvarez continued, "I'm ordering an immediate forensic audit of all Emerald Estates HOA financial records and communications for the past 5 years, to be conducted by an independent examiner appointed by the court." She turned to Sarah. "Ms. Chen, please prepare the appropriate orders for my signature by tomorrow morning." As the court adjourned, Thomas felt a weight lifting from his shoulders. Outside on the courthouse steps, reporters clustered around Sarah as she made a brief statement. "Today's ruling affirms that homeowners associations cannot exceed their legitimate authority, and that developers cannot use them as instruments to circumvent property rights. She stated, Mr. Miller looks forward to rebuilding what was wrongfully destroyed and to continuing his family's agricultural tradition. As they made their way through the media scrum to Sarah's car, Thomas noticed a group of Emerald Estates residents gathered at the edge of the crowd. To his surprise, several nodded respectfully in his direction. One woman even approached hesitantly. Mr. Millard, she said, I'm Lisa Townsend. I live in Emerald Estates, but I want you to know not all of us supported what happened to your farm. Some of us moved there because we loved the idea of living near local agriculture. She glanced back at her neighbors. We're organizing to replace the current HOA board. We thought, maybe you could advise us on how to create more reasonable bylaws that respect our neighbors. Thomas studied her face, finding only sincerity. I'd be happy to help, he said finally, though I'm not sure I'm the best expert on HOA governance. Lisa smiled. Maybe not, but you're certainly an expert on standing up for what's right. As Thomas drove home that evening, he passed the entrance to Emerald Estates. For the first time in months, the sight didn't fill him with dread. The battle wasn't over. The civil case for damages would continue, and rebuilding his farm would take time and resources he wasn't sure he had. But today's victory had restored something essential, his belief that justice was still possible, even for one farmer standing against the powerful interests trying to reshape his community. The gentle hum of bees filled the air as Thomas carefully positioned the last of the new hives in the wildflower meadow. Nearly a year had passed since the courthouse victory, and the landscape of his farm had transformed once again, not to its former state, but into something new and, in many ways, more vibrant. The rebuilding had begun slowly. The first priority had been restoring the barn, which local carpenters and preservation specialists had volunteered to help repair using traditional methods. What had started as a small community effort had grown into a movement, with weekend volunteer groups arriving to help clear debris, rebuild the chicken coop, and replant the destroyed gardens. The bees were the latest addition, 50 new hives to replace the 25 that had been taken. The expanded apiary was a statement of defiance and renewal, funded in part by the initial settlement payment from the defendants. The legal aftermath had been sweeping and swift. Facing overwhelming evidence and public outrage, Pinnacle Homes had offered a substantial settlement rather than proceed to trial. Diane Westfield, James Harrington, and Richard Finch had been indicted on multiple felony charges including fraud, forgery, and conspiracy. The scandal had effectively ended their careers and sent shockwaves through development communities across the state. The most satisfying outcome, however, had been the complete restructuring of the Emerald Estates HOA. With Lisa Townsend now serving as president, the association had adopted a new charter focused on community building rather than restriction enforcement. They had established a community garden on a previously unused corner of the development, with Thomas serving as an advisor on sustainable growing practices. Several Emerald Estates residents now kept their own small raised bed gardens and had become regular customers at Thomas's rebuilt farm stand. Quite the transformation, remarked Sarah Chen, who had arrived for the grand reopening celebration scheduled for that afternoon. She surveyed the property with evident satisfaction. The lawsuit's final settlement had been substantial enough to not only rebuild what was lost, but to expand Thomas' operation in ways he'd previously only dreamed about. I couldn't have done it without you, Thomas replied, leading her toward the new education center that occupied the east side of his property. A simple but elegant structure built with sustainable materials and designed to host workshops on beekeeping, organic gardening, and traditional agricultural practices. Oh, I just provided the legal framework, Sarah demurred. You provided the courage and determination, and all these people provided the community support. She gestured toward the dozens of volunteers setting up tables and tents for the celebration, a mix of longtime supporters and Emerald Estates residents working side by side. Rebecca John was there too, now working on a book about HOA abuses nationwide that had grown out of her investigative series. The exposure of the Emerald Estates scandal had sparked legislative reform efforts in several states, with new bills proposing stricter oversight of homeowners associations and stronger protections for property rights. By mid-afternoon, nearly 300 people had gathered for the celebration. Tables groaned under the weight of potluck dishes, many incorporating vegetables from Thomas's garden or honey from his hives. Children darted between displays demonstrating various aspects of sustainable farming, their faces alight with discovery. Thomas stood on the porch of his farmhouse, taking in the scene with quiet amazement. A year ago, he had watched in despair as everything he valued was methodically destroyed. Today, he witnessed something he never could have predicted, the rebirth of not just his farm, but a sense of genuine community that transcended the arbitrary boundaries of developments and zoning maps. Mayor Williams approached, hand extended. "Mr. Miller, on behalf of the city of Oak Ridge Heights, I want to present you with this." He handed Thomas an official proclamation declaring the day Miller Farm Heritage Day in recognition of his contribution to preserving the region's agricultural traditions. "Thank you, Mayor," Thomas said, genuinely moved. "Though I have to say your administration's support was a bit delayed." The mayor had the grace to look abashed. "Yes, well, sometimes it takes a crisis to reveal what truly matters to a community. The council has unanimously approved a new agricultural heritage protection zone that will prevent this kind of situation from happening again." As the celebration continued into evening, fairy lights strung between trees illuminated the gathering. Thomas found himself standing at the property line between his farm and Emerald Estates, where the developer had been forced to create the buffer zone mandated by the court. What had once been a stark boundary was now a shared space with benches and native plantings creating a natural transition between the two properties. Lisa Townsend joined him there, 2 glasses of honey maid in hand. She offered one to Thomas. To unlikely neighbors, she proposed as a toast. Thomas clinked his glass against hers. "And to standing your ground, even when the ground beneath you is being bulldozed." They sipped the sweet liquid, watching as residents from both sides of the former divide mingled freely in the gathering dusk. In the distance, the lights of Oak Ridge Heights twinkled, the city expanding inexorably outward. But here, in this moment, something precious had been not just preserved but strengthened. The understanding that true community isn't built through uniformity and restriction, but through respect for diversity and a shared commitment to protecting each person's right to create their own vision of home. As Thomas returned to the celebration, a young couple approached with their daughter, a bright-eyed girl of about 8. "Mr. Miller," the father said, "Emma here has a question about beekeeping. She's thinking of starting a science project on pollination." Thomas knelt to the girl's level. "Well, Emma, bees have been teaching humans important lessons for thousands of years. The most important one might be that even the smallest creatures can build something amazing if they work together." He glanced up at the parents. "Would you like to see inside a hive tomorrow? I could use an assistant." The girl's face lit up with excitement, and Thomas felt once again the profound satisfaction of passing knowledge forward, of preserving not just land and traditions, but the connection between people and the natural world that had sustained his family for generations. As night fell fully, Thomas stood on his porch one last time, watching as the final guests departed. The farm was quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet than before, not the isolation of a holdout against progress, but the peaceful rest of a place that had found its purpose anew. The battle against Emerald Estates had nearly cost him everything, but in defending his property, Thomas had gained something even more valuable, a community that recognized the worth of what he had been protecting all along. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. There were crops to tend, hives to manage, workshops to prepare. But tonight, under a canopy of stars visible from his land in a way they never would be from the manicured confines of Emerald Estates, Thomas Miller allowed himself to simply be grateful for the farm that had been his heritage, for the people who had helped him save it, and for the future they were all building together, one small act of resistance and renewal at a time.